Hi everybody. So let's talk about our first lesson, Intro to Ecology. Today we're going to go over some basic vocabulary terms to start off our unit. First of all, let's start with the learning targets that will be covered in this video. So by the end of this video, we should be able to say, I can identify the parts of an ecosystem, and I can compare and contrast biotic and abiotic factors. First of all, let's talk about this unit, ecology. What does the word ecology even mean? All right, so ecology is the study of how living things interact with each other and with their environment. So when we talk about the study of ecology, we're going to talk about two fundamental things. We're going to talk about the ecosystem, and we're going to talk about specifically the organisms within that ecosystem. Let's take a look at the word ecology. Right? So we have eco and ology, the study of, right? So all of this comes to the study of how living things interact with one another. Let's move on. When we talk about ecology, we have to take into consideration that our ecosystems are constantly changing. And along with that, the animals within the ecosystems are constantly changing. So as we start to go into the ecology unit, we want to keep in mind our evolution unit and this idea of natural selection, right? Where the changes in the environment or the interactions between organisms within an environment drive the process of natural selection and evolution. So as a scientist, as we study those interactions, especially those interactions that drive natural selection, a scientist who studies that specifically would be called an ecologist. So when we talk about a person who studies ecology, we call them an ecologist, right? So that suffix of ist means someone who studies how living things interact with each other and their environment. When we talk about the word ecosystem, we're talking about a community that consists of biotic and abiotic factors in an area and their interactions. When we talk about the word biotic, we are talking about all the living things, all the living parts of an ecosystem. When we talk about abiotic, we're talking about all the non-living things in an ecosystem. Bio, the root meaning life. Ik meaning a suffix meaning an adjective of. And then again, so here we have biotic in the word abiotic, meaning living, and then a, the prefix meaning not. So again, an ecosystem is made up of all our living and non-living parts of all living and non-living factors within a specific area and all of their interactions with each other within the living things and within the living things and the non-living parts of the ecosystem. So let's look at this and ask the question, is a lake an ecosystem? So is it an area with living and non-living things interacting with each other, or is it just a piece of a larger ecosystem? What do you think? If you said both, you'd be correct. A lake is both an ecosystem in and of itself, and it can be part of a larger ecosystem. For example, St. Clair Lake, right, is part of the larger Great Lakes watershed, right? The system of water and river and lakes that are all connected. How about a log in a forest? If we're walking through the forest, we come along a log. Is that log its own ecosystem, or is it part of a larger ecosystem? What do you think? If you think both, you're correct. A log is an ecosystem within itself, right? Within a log, there are living things and there are non-living things within the area of the log. that are interacting with one another. So it totally is an ecosystem. It's also part of a larger ecosystem, right? Because a log came from a tree. And if we're talking like a forest ecosystem, that log would be a part of that larger ecosystem. What about a human being? So is the human body an ecosystem, or is it part of an ecosystem? What do you think? The answer is both. As a human, of course, we're part of a larger ecosystem. Humans, we interact with living and the non-living parts of our environment all the time. But we're also an ecosystem. If we think about, especially if we think about our gut, our intestines are filled with billions and billions of many different types of bacteria whose job is to break down the food that we eat. And there are living and non-living things within our intestines, right? We've got all those bacteria. We also have the non-living things, water and minerals, environments, right? There's temperature. So the human body itself is an ecosystem and is also part of a larger ecosystem. So again, what's the main takeaway here? Is that ecosystems can vary in size. Right? So an ecosystem could be something as small as a small pond found inside of a forest, or it could be part of a larger water system or something like, all like an ocean. So when we talk about an ecosystem, we really have to define the area that we're talking about, and then we're talking about all the living and non-living things within that area, whether it's a small area or something that's very, very large. So when we talk about the parts of an ecosystem, we have to talk about both the abiotic and the biotic factors. Most of us, when we think about an ecosystem, we think about the plants and the trees and the plants, the trees, the fungus species. We look at the animals that live in that ecosystem. So we're very familiar with the biotic factors. Something that sometimes trips us up is the abiotic factors. The abiotic factors being the non-living parts. And sometimes we think that non-living means non-important. But of course, a rabbit, a fox, a snake, none of them can survive without air. Right? None of them can survive without water. So abiotic factors, no, they're not living things. They are the non-living parts, but they are really important to the biotic factors in the ecosystem. Let's go ahead and talk about if something is biotic or abiotic. Let's look at the example of water. Is water biotic or is water abiotic? Water is abiotic. Even though living things need water to survive, the water itself, H2O, is not a living thing. It supports living things, but it itself is not a living thing. Are mushrooms biotic or abiotic? What do you think? Mushrooms are biotic. They're not a plant or an animal, but they are a really important part of an ecosystem. They're a decomposer. They belong to the fungi family. What about the nutrients in the soil? Are they biotic or abiotic? The nutrients in an ecosystem are abiotic. So we're talking about the potassium, the calcium, the nitrogen, all of these elements and compounds that are in the soil are non-living. They are very important to the plants that need them in order to grow and carry out functions, but the nutrients themselves are abiotic. If we were to think about an ecosystem, for example, a saltwater ecosystem, let's go ahead and talk about what would be the biotic and abiotic factors of that ecosystem. For biotic factors, you would expect organic matter. You would expect living things, so all the living things in that ecosystem, including, for example, oysters, blue crabs, microscopic zooplankton, microscopic phytoplankton, which are animal-like plankton, and plant-like plankton, those two words. And jellyfish, these are all examples of biotic factors. Along with organic matter would be the waste from these animals. It would be animals or plants that had died and were decomposing. So anything that comes from things that were living or once living is going to be wrapped up in that category of organic matter. But again, if we're looking at an ecosystem, we're not just looking at the living things. We have to take into consideration the non-living things of that ecosystem. We have to look at the climate, right? The pattern of weather over time. We have to look at all the non-living parts. We have to take into consideration the amount of sunlight, the temperature at that time. If we're saying an ecosystem in a specific season, we have to look at the nutrients available, the humidity, how much moisture is there in the air and available, and the quality of the soil. Right? What minerals are present? Right? That's nutrient enrichment. But if we're looking at the soil, is it sand? Is it clay? Is it gravelly? So what is the soil made of? What do we find that's present there? So as we wrap up this lesson, we should go ahead and look at this picture on the right. Look at this picture of this coral reef. This coral reef, is this an ecosystem or is it part of an ecosystem? Well, it's both, right? A coral reef is a very specific ecosystem. It's a very biodiverse, right? Lots of different plants and animals and species living there. The other part of it is it's part of an ecosystem. It's part of a larger marine or saltwater ecosystem. If you look at this picture, what are some of the biotic and abiotic factors that you can see in this picture? Let's list some abiotic factors. Of course, we can see the sand. We have the rocks with which the coral are growing on. We have the water, the salt water, of course, and of course we can see sunlight coming in, right, providing sun energy for the photosynthetic organisms that live in this ecosystem. What are some of the biotic factors? Our different species of fish, our coral, right, the microscopic animals that live within the coral, and what we can't see would be things like phytoplankton and zooplankton and all sorts of little invertebrates that are in and around our coral reef as well. So that wraps up our intro to ecology lesson. I hope this has been a good review for you on what is ecology and what are those abiotic and biotic factors that make up the ecosystems that we'll be studying throughout this ecology unit.